your final approach to Lebanon Airport, New Hampshire. Please extinguish your cigarettes. The captain advises the weather is overcast and the ground temperature near freezing. He also reminds you that the safest portion of your journey is now over, so drive carefully on your way home from the airport. Thank you for flying with us.
We fastened our safety belts, the brakes were put on, and at that moment the plane hit the ground very hard, and I thought, oh, it must be a clumsy landing. And the next moment everything in front of me was in flames. I was in the last seat on the aisle, and the air hostess was strapped in next to me. She freed herself, put the flames out on my hair, rushed to the emergency exit, and tried to force it open. My left foot was jammed. I freed it after a while and almost forgot to open my safety belt. Then I frantically rushed after the air hostess. A man helped to open her the emergency exit, and thank God we were free. And we stepped outside, and I suddenly noticed we were at great height, and before I could think how to get down from the tail, I just slipped and fell through enormous height. And I think I fell through a pine tree which held, that each branch held my fall, so luckily after a long time I landed very softly. My husband died in the plane. I'm just going to see him.
Your chances of dying in an airline accident are 1 in a million. On the basis of passenger miles flown, airline travel is the safest way to get from point to point. But calculated on the basis of the time exposed to danger, an hour spent in an airliner is much more dangerous than an hour spent in a bus or a train or even your own car. It all depends on how you interpret the statistics and which expert you listen to.
The level of safety in scheduled airline travel in the last 5 years borders on the unbelievable. We've averaged 250 deaths per year. It's a remarkable safety record.
Safety is relative. I think we have a very reasonable level of safety, but it can be higher, and it should be higher. When you know that you can do certain things that would raise this level, that would save lives, and you don't do it, then you're wrong.
The accidents are so rare in airline aviation that we're working where it takes a great deal of money to gain a very slight increase in safety.
Any airplane could be safer by the addition of safety devices, by the expenditure of more money. So of course, if we reach the point where it gets so heavy, then we're not going to be able to put any passengers on it, and we've defeated the very utilization that we're after.
People are reluctant to talk about air safety in public. It's sort of a closed subject. You don't discuss it out in the open. People in the industry, it's sort of a sacred thing. I think they've for many, many years, going way back, aviation was a difficult thing to sell. And certainly at one time it was a very, very hazardous thing, back in the days when the airplanes were tied together with baling wire and fabric. So I think over the years, everybody that grew up in the industry, they've been selling aviation, selling safety and so forth, which is natural and good. But it's got to the point where you just don't unsell it in any way. You never criticize it. You're supposed to not outside of the inner circle.
Major airline crashes occur on an average of once a month in North America. Pilots say there are many crashes which could have been prevented, and many people die needlessly in accidents which should have been survivable. No airline is immune from accidents. No airplane is completely safe. Danger areas are clearly indicated: landing and takeoff, mid-air collision, inadequate runways, outdated radar control, hijacking and sabotage, mechanical malfunction, inadequate training and testing. Every time a new airplane design is put into service, there is a probability it will crash a few times before it is mechanically fail-safe and pilots learn to fly it. In 1964, the Boeing company rolled out its 727, a fast medium-range jet much in demand by the airlines. Pilots described it as a sweet airplane, very easy to fly. For 18 months, there were no mishaps. Then several 727 crashes in quick succession. One was in Cincinnati. American Airlines Flight 383 from New York crashed and burned on approach to landing at Greater Cincinnati Airport. 5 seconds before it hit, the last radio message from the pilots indicated they did not know they were approaching too low. The safety board stated the probable cause of this accident was the failure of the crew to properly monitor the altimeters during a visual approach into deteriorating visibility conditions.
The true cause of the accident really was an operating type of procedure that was wrong, a training procedure, and also the airplane itself had a peculiarity that entered into it.
Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between a design problem in the airplane and the training that goes with the airplane, training to the flight crews. So that in the 727, as an example, pilots in the early days were flying the airplane very likely with insufficient information about its characteristics.
3 of them they blamed on pilots. 2 of the accidents were labeled unknown, and the other one, it was in a foreign country. I don't know what the final determination was, but they're all similar type of an accident in that it was occurred in a descent to a landing, and they just went right on in. They didn't check their descent. They corrected the problem, but they never publicly labeled the problem.
The Boeing company states that only one of the 727 accidents was associated with a high descent rate or sink rate, and that the other accidents may have been caused by other factors. However, pilots were warned to pay strict attention to the landing characteristics of this airplane, and this type of accident did not recur. The DC-8 was the Douglas Company's entry into the big jet sweepstakes. The plane performed splendidly, but after years of service it was involved in crashes where the pilots got into high-speed dives from which they could not pull out. High-speed dives on DC-8s were involved in the Air Canada crash at St. Therese, Quebec, and the Eastern Airlines crash in Lake Pontchartrain.
The fact that that horizontal stabilizer was found in the wreckage of both airplanes in the full nose-down position is indicative of the fact that there was a control problem. The Canadian government felt that in their finding, and so did the Civil Aeronautics Board.
The investigations of the DC-8 centered around the flat part of the tail known as the horizontal stabilizer. It was discovered that in the full nose-down position, the plane could go into an unrecoverable dive.
Douglas Company was very anxious to make the change, and they did it voluntarily without any requirement on the part of the government, and all they did was restrict the area of movement. On the DC-8, they restricted it from an ability of the pilot to put the horizontal stabilizer from 2 degrees nose down before the accidents to 1/2 a degree nose down after the accidents, and we haven't had an accident since on a high dive with the DC-8. It is my view that this defect was correctable before the plane was ever certificated.
McDonnell Douglas states that since the DC-8 flew more than 1 million miles before these 2 accidents, there could not have been a defect in the airplane. The adjustment to the controls, they say, was made to prevent pilot error. The company denies that the nose-down adjustment of the stabilizer caused the accidents. The next generation of airplane is the jumbo jet, which will roll up to already overcrowded terminals with 490 passengers in each plane. The first to make its debut is the Boeing 747, and as the christening took place in October 1968, the insurance brokers were calculating the probable crash rate. This is called the learning curve for new airplanes, and their projection, based on past experience, is that 2 of the 747s will crash in the first 18 months.
Well, I think that's too much of a generalization. We would like to have more inspectors. We do check out every airplane. We do individually certificate every jet pilot, but we do delegate to the airlines on a designee basis the piston pilots because we don't have enough inspectors to go around.
Obviously, there will be some flight tests conducted by FAA test pilots. But the bulk of the design, of the testing of the material, the majority of the flight tests will all be conducted by company employees who are interested in producing an economical aircraft that can make a profit for another business, an airline.
We spot check it, we fly it, we keep people in his factories looking at it, but we do not take responsibility and could not for the millions of parts and the millions of man-hours that goes into making every airplane. This would be like looking at every automobile by some government inspector. We think that we have about the right balance on spot checking, him certifying, him performing the test and showing us. But in the end result, we'll fly it ourselves.
People who fly are mostly very anxious to get to their destination, but 1 in every 100 million wants to blow up the airplane with himself or someone else on board. There have been 9 cases of sabotage in North America, the motive usually to collect the insurance.
Maximum $225,000. I think air travel insurance should be less because I think the risk is lower than that. I think the rate is high. You are. I think it's a rather safe means of transportation, but I still carry insurance.
I think we should eliminate the slot machine insurance vending machines where you throw a quarter in and buy a lot of insurance, because we have had situations where some deranged individual buys a bunch of insurance by putting money in a slot machine type of a gadget and buys all this insurance. I think a deranged person, a person bent on suicide, or a person that wants to kill somebody else by putting a bomb on an airplane, I think he would think twice about going before a reputable insurance agents and sitting down and taking out insurance. And I think that, because one state did take action and outlawed these vending machines, I think insurance vending machines should be taken out of airport terminals.
Whether vending machines contribute or not, sabotage continues to be a threat. A device to detect explosives is now being tested in some airports by the FAA.
We have developed a laboratory model of an instrument which can detect a variety of explosives, which would not require any examination of any individual person or of his baggage. Just as he walked on board an airplane or through an enclosure, he would be electronically scanned. And by a variety of techniques, we could tell either whether there are explosives or weapons carried on board him. I don't want to get into exactly how this can be done, because whenever one poses a technological problem, there are enough nuts in the world to take this on as a personal challenge.
A more frequent danger in the air comes from people who don't want to destroy an airplane, but merely to borrow it at gunpoint. There were 19 cases of hijacking in the U.S. and Canada up to mid-December 1968. To determine which passenger is carrying a weapon is a difficult technical problem. Some progress is being made, but there's an urgent need for countries to adopt an extradition treaty for hijackers. Pilots have plenty of problems without having to deal with hijackers or saboteurs. To hoist 100 tons of airplane into the sky is a process of considerable complexity. If anything goes wrong, the takeoff must be aborted before the plane reaches critical speed, which is known to pilots as V1. Pilots say the V1 speed is not reliable because most runways are too short. If they have trouble on takeoff, an accident is inevitable.
V1 is our takeoff decision speed. It's a point on the takeoff where it's a go or no-go situation. Below that particular speed, on that particular airplane, on that runway, and that gross weight and so forth, before you obtain that speed, you theoretically can stop the takeoff, and there's sufficient runway left to get the airplane stopped before going off again.
It is my view that if a pilot has to abort on a runway-limited airport at V1, at decision speed, that he will not be able to stop the aircraft. That means it's an inevitable accident.
In 1964, a TWA flight taking off from Rome was approaching V1 when something went wrong. At the controls was Captain Lowell.
two indications showed up, and so I aborted the takeoff. As a result, my outboard engine collided with a piece of construction equipment. The plane exploded, burned up. Nobody was killed because of impact forces. The people died because of the fire. They couldn't get out of the airplane. I went out the cockpit window. I couldn't get back in the passenger compartment because, in this case, the forward chute was jammed up and people couldn't get out. So I went out the window with the idea of getting it below the chute and helping people down. A lot of people just simply never got out.
Well, you may recall about, I guess it must be about the better part of 2 years ago, there was a new rule on evacuation which called for required the airlines to conduct drills and demonstrations to prove that an airplane with only half the exits open could be cleared in 90 seconds. And so that's one example, the size of the doors and the matter of a clear path to the doors.
The present system of emergency escape system from an airline is just an absolute disgrace. It's a Mickey Mouse system, and it's a system of opening doors and inflating chutes that you slide down, and it's cumbersome. It's difficult to get them in operation. Half the time they don't work. The history of these chutes is pretty sad. They changed the evacuation demonstration from 2 minutes to 90 seconds. It's a rehearsed drill, so to speak, and it doesn't coincide with the realities of an emergency situation.
To determine the effect of fire and impact, the FAA crashed this plane and recorded the results on high-speed cameras. They learned that seat moorings should be strengthened and meal trays padded, and some of these changes have already been made. Other recommendations call for smoke hoods and improved escape mechanisms. One promising experiment tested rubber balloons, which inflate instantly to cushion bodies from the impact of a crash. Engineers believe the most promising single experiment is the development of a jellied fuel, similar to napalm. Ordinary jet fuel explodes and burns violently a few seconds after it catches fire. Gel fuel burns slowly and does not explode. But safety experts say the development will take many years, unless there is public pressure on the airlines and the government to develop it faster. Of all the causes of airplane accidents, landings continue to be the most dangerous. Runways are too short. Approaches are cluttered with factory chimneys and apartment buildings. Navigation aids are inadequate or malfunction. Captain Lowell describes what he calls one of the most hazardous places to set down an airplane, LaGuardia in New York.
This airport here is one of the problem airports, LaGuardia. It's been the scene of many accidents. And just recently, one airplane hit this pier out here, approaching during low ceilings, poor visibility, and his wheels caught the end of that pier and knocked the gear out. Fortunately, he was able to pull out and nobody was hurt. This runway is relatively short, and this is why they built that pier out there, to lengthen it a little bit. Approaching in bad weather, when you're approaching strictly on instruments, the airplane will touch down 700 feet from the end of the runway. Of course, the pilot is sitting way up, and his landing gear is way below him. And you only have, I think, 26-foot clearance with the landing gear with that steel pier out there. I think too often the pilot's used as a scapegoat. For instance, this runway. We're talking about this runway out here. This has been approved. The instrument landing system has been approved by the FAA. It's been approved by the airline operators, the length of the runway. So what else could be wrong? If a pilot hits that steel pier, he's got to be at fault. It's approved. And the point is that, of course, on a day-to-day operation, hundreds of airplanes are landing there, and they don't knock their gear off. But then we operate under all kinds of weather conditions, and when the weather is bad, your margin is reduced with this sort of an operation, and eventually something will happen. Combine it with a minor error in the altimeter. When I'm talking about a minor error, you don't need much of an error in your altimeter reading to clip the end of that pier. And you won't even know it. You think everything is fine, and all of a sudden you hit something. And this has happened and does happen.
It did happen in November 1968 when Japan Airlines with 96 persons on board landed in San Francisco Bay, 3 miles short of the runway. The pilot was 900 feet below where he should have been when he broke through the fog. Why he misread his altimeter is a mystery, but pilots believe there should be safer landing systems to prevent such mishaps. The Japan airliner was equipped with a radio altimeter, but its warning light flashed too late to prevent an accident. A Navy test of this standard altimeter found that experienced pilots misread it 10% of the time. It takes only one misreading to cause an accident. The only certain way to bring an airliner down in zero weather is to have a computer at the controls. Fully automated landings like this McDonnell Douglas system are within the state-of-the-art, as these pilots demonstrate with their hands totally off the controls. But more research and development is needed, and it will cost about $100 million to get an operating system. This is approximately equal to what it would cost in insurance settlements in the crash of one jumbo jet. Jet planes make so much noise that living is unpleasant within 50 square miles of an airport. The jumbo jets will be quieter than present aircraft, but supersonic transports will be much worse. Yet new houses and apartments continue to be built under the flight path.
There's a wide variation in the threshold of damage in different people, but a single flyover at a level around 140 decibels would or should probably cause some minor hearing loss in a young child who had not had any permanent hearing damage prior to that.
When citizens complain enough, they get action. At many airports, microphones are installed off the end of the runways, and pilots are required to cut back on their engines to reduce noise. At Kennedy in New York, a special tower observes every takeoff and records how much noise the pilot makes. If he rings the gong, his airline gets a nasty letter. Some pilots know where the ground microphones are located and cut their engines back for a few seconds as they fly over. Most pilots believe the noise abatement procedures involve unnecessary risk to the safety of the airplane. Captain Lowell says it may have contributed to one fatal accident.
They had an accident out of Kennedy a few years ago with a jet that took off and went into Jamaica Bay. It was determined later, after the investigation, that this airplane had a mechanical malfunction in the rudder boost system. But the fact is, if he'd been making a normal takeoff, climbed out normally, maintained speed and altitude in a normal way without making a low altitude turn and power reduction, he would have been able to overcome this problem, and he would not have crashed. There was quite a bit of controversy on that particular accident because the official accident report did not blame the noise abatement procedures.
This runway was built without our knowledge. We had no idea that they were pointing these runways directly over us until the first planes came over. This smell is the odor of the fuel, the jet fuel. This we get when the winds are from the northwest direction, and sometimes it's intolerable. They tell us that it's non-toxic and that it's non-dangerous, but it seems to us that it's not so. Sometimes we just gag. We can't breathe at all down. These planes will take off at intervals of less than 1 minute apart, and they'll keep this up right up to about 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning at times. And then they'll start in again around 6 in the morning, 7 in the morning, whereas it's almost impossible for us to sleep.
Every city in the world is outgrowing its airport. Traffic nearly doubles every 5 years. More runways and more airports are desperately needed, but everywhere citizens want them to locate somewhere else. New York has been trying for 10 years to get a 4th jetport, but most areas can bring enough political pressure to keep it away.
You can do the same. In my 16 years as your representative in Congress, I never saw anything as dramatic as the unity with which the people rose against this proposal to violate the character of their neighborhoods and to destroy values in an effort to put a jet port in an unsuitable location.
I wouldn't live within 50 miles of an airport. And anybody that does live, in fact, do you know that there's a town outside of Los Angeles that is suing the town of Los Angeles, some 80,000 people, for emotional problems caused by aircraft noise?
We've got Somerset County fairly nicely situated, and I would hate to see it destroyed.
Small private airplanes outnumber jetliners 50 to 1. Some of them are as well equipped as an airliner, but many don't even have a radio. Students can buzz around through the landing areas of major airports an hour after their first solo. 40 new planes are built every day, and the accident rate for small planes keeps going up. To prevent mid-air collisions, the FAA and the Air Transport Association have developed a collision avoidance system, which warns pilots of the approach of other planes and tells them what to do to avoid a crash. McDonnell Douglas built the system and is using it on its own planes, but it won't be installed in airliners until 1972 at the earliest. Even then, it won't prevent collisions with small planes.
We don't like getting tangled up with the airliners any more than the airliners like getting tangled up with us. The thought that you might be wiped out by one is not too realistic, and I guess we don't think about that much, even though it really happens. It happens that it's very easy for a guy to go up in a Piper Cub with sort of half a radio, perhaps a receiver only, and if his navigation is not too careful, find himself in the molten zone without perhaps realizing it himself. He may be tooling along at 2,000 feet. He could fly right through an approach path. He wouldn't know because his navigation isn't good enough. He might hear them. He might even hear them talking on the radio about a blip on their screen advising other traffic that there's somebody in the area in a certain position, altitude unknown, and not know that's him because he doesn't know where he is.
We're operating on a Lux system, more or less. We still have a very large ocean of air, and would depend a great deal on this fact alone to keep us from colliding with other airplanes.
Airport, depart northwest, noise abatement procedure, Eastern 651, runway 33.
The congestion and the fact that the traffic control system, it's a system devised some 30 years ago, it hasn't kept up with the sophisticated airplane. It's way behind.
Northwest 85, company would like to talk to you.
As of the first of this year, the Federal Aviation Administration granted immunity for the pilots and the traffic controllers if they report near misses. In other words, they're trying to get a reading to see just how bad the situation is. And since that time, unofficially, the figures are running around 200 near misses a month, which is rather frightening.
651, Clarence.
Sometimes it gets pretty hairy in the control tower. But it's even more tense at the radar center at Islip, Long Island, where every airplane converging on New York must be identified, logged, charted, and safely directed through the world's busiest air corridor.
Right in there with him is Tango 0. National 92, 7500 for now for 17,000.
National 92, I just squawk out ahead, report leaving 12,000 radar contact.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I've been present 3 times when we've had mid-air collisions. The most recent one happened when 2 aircraft theoretically were at 1,000 foot apart, but somehow managed to get together. And one was much more fortunate, made it back to Kennedy, and the other landed on the border of New York and Connecticut with loss of life. Despite the fact that the controller may not have contributed in any manner, he can't help but feeling this sense of responsibility. I think all controllers forever have the specter of a Damocles sword hanging over your head, that in the event something happened, even if you didn't contribute, you can't help feeling that perhaps there was something you might have done to alleviate this, to avoid it.
2100 IDEN.
I was working inbound traffic from the north and northwest to the Kennedy Airport. My coordinator accepted a handoff from the high altitude sector, and en route descent to Kennedy via Carmel, Riverhead, Deer Park. The aircraft came over and reported at the assigned altitude that I have marked on my flight progress strips. I identified the traffic, verified the identification, issued an en route descent appropriate for traffic. His clearance was from the high altitude, which would be somewhere above 23,000,
to an altitude of 11,000 feet. As he was approaching the Carmel VOR, there was other traffic southwestbound from Boston to Newark Airport. And it was a normal occurrence that two aircraft vertically separated by 1,000 feet would cross over one another. There was nothing different than doesn't happen at least maybe 100 times a day. The next thing I know, the Transworld aircraft made reference to the fact that he just had a mid-air collision. I wasn't very sure what I had heard the first time because it was startling. I just wasn't sure. I asked him to say it again. And his reply was, I just hit a blue-colored constellation. At that particular time, it was a penetrating jolt to myself. And again, I wasn't really sure what I had heard, and he verified that he had 30 feet of his left wing torn off. I made everybody around me aware of it because I don't remember exactly what I did, but I know I jumped to my feet. Within seconds after, I gave him a direct course to the Kennedy Airport, actually giving him the most expeditious handling we possibly could. I made also reference to the other controller. He didn't realize the impact of what I had heard, till maybe 2 minutes or a couple minutes after I knew what was going on. I says to the man, I says, see if you can contact this aircraft. So he did, and he says, I can't. And I says, try again and again and make sure you get him. And when he finally did get in contact with him, there was panic.
No, go ahead. I'm going to move the screen.
You handle hundreds and hundreds of aircraft a day or in a week, and you never think of them as really people in each aircraft, and you'll go crazy trying to separate people. It's this blip must not come next to this blip. And my first impulse when he told me he just hit another aircraft was, oh my gosh, those poor people. And there you are sitting with a microphone in your hand, and there's really nothing much you can do. I recall hearing, I don't remember if it was the pilot or the engineer or one of the people from the aircraft talking, and he gave his full name. I don't recall the name offhand. And he said, help us. And like I said before, you sit there with a mic in your hand. There's not much help you can give them. A safe aircraft flying, you at level flight, with all things being normal, you can help. An aircraft going down, you can't help them much. Well, how could that particular incident been avoided? It's purely conjecture on anybody's part who can what actually happened. Right at this particular time, we're giving 1,000-foot vertical separation to any aircraft. We're giving 3 miles lateral separation within 40 miles of an antenna of the radar facility using, and 5 miles after the facility. You can extend those safety procedures to infinity. You can give a guy 100 miles, but that doesn't mean that these pilots and these facilities and the equipment that they're using is up to snuff. Right now, we have two-dimensional radar. We have radar that'll tell you the direction that they're moving. We have radar that'll tell you the distance. We need vertical radar. The equipment that we really need is probably still on the drawing board. I can think of times where I could have used a better frequency. I can think of times when I could have used a better radar presentation. The pressure mounts as the traffic mounts. You come in the morning, and there are days that you can sit around and really just man your position and fly through it. I mean, it's just like any other job. But when you have bad weather, thunderstorms in the sky, snow, whatever it may be, the weather, it predicts the conditions of the radar controller and of the pilot as well. When it's bad weather, the pilots are more intent. They're listening a little more carefully. They're more concerned of what's going on. And on the other hand, when it's VFR and they can have visual reference to anything that they're flying from. They can see from here to Chicago that they're a little more lax in their operation.
526, how low can you go, 7?
In Washington, a friend of mine was working the aircraft, and he never did return to work, and this was over 8 years ago. As a matter of fact, he ultimately committed suicide. Now, as far as more recent, the one controller was out on sick leave for over 3 weeks, and he had nothing whatsoever to do with this. And the other one still bears the scars to this day. It contributed to a very unhappy home life. And frankly, every time he works in aircraft, he gets the feeling that perhaps something might happen.
You never think about coming to work and working two aircraft that are going to hit. At least I don't, or at least I try not to think about it. It's quite strenuous at this particular time for everybody concerned to be working a 6-day week. We need skilled personnel. We need skilled personnel badly. And, these people are coming in off the street, I should say, and they have some basic background, mostly military background, either former pilots, tower operators, and their knowledge of air traffic control is very limited, and you've really got to take them by the hand and lead them most of the way. And we need incentives for the more high-density areas, such as New York, Chicago, LA, or most of the big metropolitan cities, that there'd be an incentive for these men to work at these particular airports.
Unless they very quickly come up with better equipment, both radio and radar, and come up with more controllers, the situation that you saw last summer won't be 1/10 as bad as it will be in succeeding summers. It seems that every major improvement has been brought about by our major catastrophe. Hopefully, it won't take another crash to get things going right.
Money, just money. It takes money, and we could have probably the best sophisticated air traffic control system that's available. I hope it doesn't take another mid-air collision, because I don't think how anybody could possibly explain not having this equipment at the next mid-air collision. When lives are concerned, you can't put a price on someone's life or put a price on safety.